With your successful career in the police force and working as an undercover officer in Toronto's drug squad, I imagine you have seen most of the implications the illegal trade of marijuana and other drugs had on the city of Toronto and its citizens. Over the past few months, there have been many illegal marijuana dispensaries opening and getting shut down across the city. How are these illegal dispensaries able to open up in plain sight of the public in the first place? And what do you believe is the perfect solution for dispensaries in the future when marijuana is legalized?
That is a really complicated question, but I'll do my best. First of all, I want to be really clear. Marijuana clearly has, since 1922, been a prohibited substance in this country. It was against the law. I've been in the law enforcement business, but more importantly, and I wanted to begin by clarifying this, more importantly, I've been in the public safety business. It was my job to protect kids, keep neighborhoods safe, maintain order in communities, and to a large extent, that involves reducing harm. And frankly, I'm going to talk a lot about harm reduction approaches and public health approaches, because that's what we're trying to undertake now. In all the years that I've been a police officer in Toronto and the police chief, I never once had a young person die of a marijuana overdose. But where I saw an enormous amount of harm was in some of our communities where I went to far too many violent shooting occurrences where young people had been shot to death in disputes over the territory and the turf under which marijuana was being trafficked. And so the harms associated to that drug had much to do with the way in which the drug was being produced, distributed, and consumed, and less and there are risks in that drug, and I'll talk about some of those, I'm sure, in response to some of your questions. But there is a lot of harms, social harms related to its production, distribution, and consumption. Now, when our government came in, and the Prime Minister, before he was the Prime Minister, said, if we're elected, we're going to legalize, regulate, and restrict the access to this drug, and we articulated very clearly why we were doing it. We wanted to keep it out of the hands of kids, and we'll talk about that more, I'm sure, because for young people, there's real health and social risks to the use of this drug. We also want to take the business away from organized crime, because quite frankly, they don't do an awful lot of good with that money, and good can be done with it. And we wanted to make sure that we protect the health of Canadians by having a well-regulated, safe and inspected supply and regulations on how and to whom it would be sold to keep it out of the hands of people who are vulnerable and shouldn't have it, and also have some rules around its consumption so that we could have healthier and socially responsible use. So the legalization and the regulations, those are two very important concepts that go together. Frankly, if all we were going to do is legalize it, Ralph would be absolutely right. It'd be a colossal blunder, and we'd make a mess of this thing. So what we're talking about is having a different system of control, a smarter system of control, to reduce those social and health harms. Now, inevitably, when you make a promise like that, a lot of people think it's something that can be done like that. As I have discovered, it's enormously complex work to put the regulatory frameworks in place for production, distribution, and consumption. It takes time. But not surprisingly, there are entrepreneurs who saw an opportunity to make money, a lot of money, by the way, and jumped into that market. And so you ask, why wouldn't the police just go and lock them all up? They're clearly breaking the law. But the police have limited resources, and they try to respond to what people legitimately are concerned about in their community. And quite frankly, the people of Toronto, I'll tell you, have greater concerns in many cases than the activities of the dispensaries. Now, they are concerned about the dispensaries, and they're concerned about, the unregulated sale of this drug and the unregulated production of this drug. And so it is something the police have to deal with. But in all the things that they have to deal with on a priority basis, it's not the highest priority. And therefore, the ones that were perhaps most blatant and reckless in the way in which they were doing business got the attention of the police, and some of the others have not got that type of attention.
As chief of police, you were never on record for supporting legalization of cannabis, and now that you have considerable influence in directing policy, do you feel that you have a conflict of interest with liberal insiders who stand to gain significant financial benefit from the policies?
Excellent question, and I'm delighted for the opportunity.
Excellent question.
It is. It's a comprehensive question. The information that you provided is interesting and only partially accurate.
That's what I say. Partially accurate.
And therefore misleading. It's kind of like when people used to say to me, well, this is in the newspaper. And much of what you've just shared with us was right out of the newspapers. Mark Twain once said that if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed, and if you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed. I might suggest you're partially misinformed, and I say that with great respect. I could actually give you a much longer list of people who serve on various boards and have various applications. There are close to 2,500 applications currently before Health Canada to obtain a license for the production of cannabis. There are former Conservative premiers on those boards from several provinces, cabinet ministers, members of Parliament, very prominent, well-known Conservative members. And quite frankly, I'm not going to name them to you, if you don't mind, because I impugn no misconduct on their part. It's a legal process they're involved in. The people that you name, to the best of my knowledge, none of them yet have acquired a license from Health Canada. They are also in the queue in making applications, but they haven't done it. Now, there are, as of today, 40 organizations that have received licenses. 36 of those received them before my government came into power. The 4 that have received their licenses since we came into power are very small producers and are none of the groups to which you have just named. And so to suggest that anybody's getting a particular advantage because of their political affiliation, frankly, is not accurate. But having said that, what I have been very positive about, and I would encourage you if you get the opportunity, as a cop, I used to have to deal with marijuana home grows, where whole neighborhoods, houses, factories would be given over to the illegal production of cannabis. They were mold infested. My cops used to have to go in wearing like spacesuits because of the health risk of going in there. The houses were rendered virtually uninhabitable. Their proximity to other houses, to schools, to kids, represented a very significant health risk. There was hydro bypasses and fire risks, sometimes explosions, because they would also do aftermarket processing using explosive butane and blow things up. And so my experience as a cop with cannabis production was always really negative. And then I went to a licensed producer. The regulations that control the production of medical marijuana at a licensed producer, the regulations are voluminous. It's a huge document. And they are subject to strict oversight and control, very strict security, sanitation. And what we get from a licensed producer is a product of known potency, purity, and provenance. And this is really important in a medical marijuana regime. People have to know the dosage of what they're taking, its potency. They also have to be assured that it doesn't have illegal chemicals. And the whole operation is conducted in such a way which is more responsible to the neighborhood about venting and air quality, security, safety, sanitation, et cetera. And so when asked about licensed producers, I will tell you that I have become confident that this can be done right under a strict regulatory regime, because I've seen it done wrong in the absence of those regulations. I will also point out to you, in October of 2014, while I was still the police chief and before I had any political affiliation, the Center of Addiction and Mental Health published a report advocating for a public health framework in the regulation of cannabis, legalization and a public health regulation, or a strict regulation of cannabis. And I spoke very publicly at that time that government policy should be based on evidence and not on some political calculation or the electoral map. And this was the first well-documented, evidentiary-based advocacy around a different way of controlling this substance. And I spoke very positively about it at that time.
By legalizing marijuana, does Canada run the risk of running afoul of the UN? Are there any potential consequences, or do you think this is something that they won't bother to enforce?
I wouldn't presume to say what the UN's going to do, but I will tell you I've had a great deal of discussion with the United Nations Organization of Drug Control, bilateral discussions with our most prominent partners on this file. And again, there are issues in those international conventions. The international conventions were signed in 1962. Since that time, a number of countries, not the least of which the United States, have had eight states in the United States have legalized marijuana. 28 of them have legalized medical marijuana, which, if in a very technical reading of those conventions, might have put them in contravention of those conventions. One of the things that I think is little understood because it's very rarely mentioned. I find in the media, everyone talks about legalization of marijuana. And again, I would say, if that's all we were going to do, I think it would create real jeopardy for Canada in relation to those 3 international conventions. But of course, that's not all we're going to do. And for some reason, the media seems awfully reluctant to acknowledge the rest of the promise, which is to strictly regulate, to restrict its access, to regulate production, distribution, and consumption. And what is almost never sort of acknowledged and understood, that production outside of the regulatory regime will still be a criminal offense. Trafficking of marijuana outside of the regulatory regime will still be a criminal offense. Importation and exportation of marijuana produced outside of the licensed regime and absent of the necessary permits and agreements internationally would still be a very serious criminal offense. And I suspect, by the way, that you'll see additional criminal offense, one in particular, that will create a new offense for selling to kids, because we're really trying to keep this out of the hands of kids. And so I think we were able to say to our international partners, yes, we're finding a better way to protect our kids, protect our communities, and protect the health of our citizens, but we are not in any way jeopardizing our bilateral or multilateral relationships with other countries around the world. We're still holding up our end, which is the spirit of those conventions, but we're looking at smarter ways to protect our own citizens and to manage this difficult issue, and it is a complicated issue, properly within our own country. And I will tell you, uniquely in the world, many countries have approached this. In Colorado, Washington, overwhelmingly a commercial model of regulation. They looked at maximizing their revenue with great respect. And if you look at our task force report, what we asked the task force to do was to look at this issue through a public health lens and to look at reducing the social and health harms. I think we're the only country that's ever approached it in this way. And we've even said, we recognize that there are both financial and revenue implications, but the revenue that was potentially generated from this as an enterprise has to be reinvested in research, public education, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation. Clearly, the approach is overwhelmingly focused on reducing social and health harms in that public health framework. And with all of those things taken in that context, I think that brings a more nuanced discussion around our compliance with those international conventions. Frankly, I think what we were able to present to the world is this is a smarter way to control the production, distribution, and consumption of this drug within our own borders, and we're not putting any other nation at risk as a result of the approach that we're taking.
A specific negative implication includes law enforcement being incapable of detecting the level of impairment of drivers. Another implication is the inability to test the potency of edibles. In your opinion, what mechanisms can be implemented to fix these issues?
Yeah, and I will tell you, we spent a lot of time talking to the people in Colorado, and they were very generous in explaining all the things that they messed up. And part of it was because they had a budget initiative, or a ballot initiative, which said that they were going to legalize it and tax it. And so the regulatory regime that they put in place was overwhelmingly focused on maximizing the revenue to be generated from that. And they didn't put anything in place, regulatory controls on production, or on things like edibles, or on the potency of products, or on the advertising of products. And so they saw a lot of marketing to kids, and a lot of problems that arose from the edible situation. And quite frankly, the technology and science around impaired detection was not in a particularly good place 5 years ago. It's getting better. It's not perfect, but it's getting enormously better. And so let me tell you, we have, and if you've read our task force report, we canvassed the evidence and looked at the experience of other jurisdictions, looked at the science, and got the best advice we could on how we should manage high-potency products, edible products. If you put it in a proper regulatory regime around production, that includes, and I say this a lot, it's a bit of a mantra, includes regulation that enables us to determine with certainty potency, purity, and provenance. And basically, potency, you have to know what's in what you're consuming, and you have to know how strong it is so that you can determine what effect it will have on you. Purity is really important because we've seen either pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, other adulterating chemicals, and sometimes other drugs, on street drugs, are mixed in, and people don't know what it is they're consuming, and there's risks associated to that, significant risks associated to that. And provenance is also important. If you want to make sure that the only thing being consumed comes from a measured, accountable, tested production environment, you have to be able to track through genetic markers seed to sale. And that's all now possible. And Colorado's doing that too, by the way. And so that's why this is kind of complicated, making sure the proper regulatory controls are in place on what's being produced, what's being consumed, what's being sold, and how much and who it's being sold to. One of the questions, and this was a really interesting discussion that we've had in government, is you can either ban something, prohibit it, or regulate it. And the things that are risky, high potency products, you have a choice. You can either say, if it's above this potency, we're going to ban it. And if you do that, the black market will fill the market and fill the gap. Or you can say we can regulate it so that we know what's in it, but we can also control a little bit of its sale and consumption through volumetric pricing. So the higher the potency, we did this with alcohol, the higher the potency, the higher the price, volumetric taxation, and greater restrictions on who it's sold to and in what amounts and circumstances under which some of these things can be consumed. And so all of those things are being strongly examined in our preparation for bringing regulations forward. I want to talk to you a little bit about impaired too, because it's a really important issue. We've been testing oral fluids testing devices for the past several months. We tested them in 8 jurisdictions across the country. They're in use in a number of other jurisdictions, and the technology and the science around that is rapidly progressing, but there are some problems with it, and I'll explain that in a second. But we've been testing them to make sure they work in a Canadian environment, mostly because of the cold, and they do, and that's a very positive thing. But you then have to pass legislation that approves that device, and the approval is based on a recommendation. There's a thing called the Society for Forensic Scientists and their Drugs and Driving Committee, and they have to make a recommendation to government for approved devices. And they have to meet a certain standard, no more than like a maximum of 5% fail rate, those types of things. And so those devices have to be allowed by law, and then they have to acquire them and train police officers how to use them. You write in law the circumstances under which that test can be demanded. Usually by our standards, it's around a test of reasonable suspicion that the person's used the drug. And then you've got to figure out what to do with the reading of that. There's also toxicology tests, but there's a bit of a problem with cannabis and the way it is dispelled from the body, and it metabolizes in different ways. I'm getting a little technical, and I apologize. But this is a complicated issue, but really important. I will tell you that we've made an absolute commitment, and I wouldn't make this commitment if I wasn't absolutely certain we can do this. We've made a commitment. We'll make sure that we have the legislation, the technology, the training, and the resources that both the police and our courts will need to keep the roadways safe. And then there's another component, and this is really important, and I alluded to it earlier, public education. People need to understand the impact of the drugs that they're consuming on their ability to drive, which means they must also have knowledge of the potency and the effects, the pharmacological effects of the drugs that they're taking. And I will tell you this, the state of the science is this. For alcohol, we say if you drink more than this amount, which is 0.08 in the current law, then you're impaired, and that's a criminal offense. It's called a per se limit. The science around most drugs, including cannabis, makes it difficult to determine with absolute precision a per se limit above which everyone is impaired. But it's equally difficult to say that there's a safe level for use, and frankly, from my perspective, and the absolute importance of keeping our roadways safe for everybody, I think as a society, we should begin with the premise, it'll be legal to use this drug, but if you use this drug, don't drive, because it does affect your ability to drive. And I think that's the right approach. I wish we'd done that with alcohol. Quite frankly, I wish we'd started there with alcohol, because we say if you drink more than this, you shouldn't drive. We're asking people to make a judgment about their ability to drive when their judgment's been impaired. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And you know, in this country, 4 people a day on average die as a result of impaired driving. And that's unacceptable. And so I will tell you, we're taking what I'm hoping will be a very responsible and through some people's lens, a very strict approach to keeping our roadways safe and how we manage impaired. And so you'll see and hear about in the not too distant future, the introduction of new legislation, new technologies, new training There's a whole bunch of things involved in that.
Drugs such as fentanyl are tied to an increasing number of deaths in Canada. To avoid seizure at the border, they're often wrapped as gifts or labeled as a household detergent with an accompanying certification. The Canada Border Services Agency also works due diligently to ensure that all goods coming into the country through the mail system or by courier are inspected. However, the agency is only authorized to open packages that weigh more than 30 grams and need the supplier's permission to open the smaller ones. In regards to this, what would you say is the best way to tackle the imports of drugs as such?
We've made some real progress on the fentanyl front. I'm sure you're aware. If you're not aware, please make yourself aware, particularly on the west coast of the country, but it's a problem right across the country. Opioid overdose and death have become an enormously significant problem in this country, and fentanyl and various derivatives of fentanyl, carfentanil in particular, are really dangerous, and particularly dangerous for what I would call the naive user, someone who's not familiar with using intravenous use of opioids and takes more than they should and is accidentally killing themselves. And we lost nearly 3,000 Canadians last year. Totally unacceptable. If we lost 3,000 people in a fire or a flood, everybody would recognize that we have a crisis on our hands. And yet, because this is people who are using drugs non-medically or recreationally, for some reason it hasn't sparked the same outrage. So it really demands a response, and a big part of that is public education. And I appreciate the opportunity just simply to say to people, in society, these are incredibly dangerous drugs, and a couple of grains of this, no bigger than a couple of grains of sand, can take you out. And if you don't know what you're doing, really, really dangerous stuff. And so everybody, please be careful. Having said that, the vast majority of the illegal fentanyl that's on our street, first of all, fentanyl has two major sources. One is diversion from the legitimate medical market, and that's a problem. People sort of surfing through somebody's medicine cabinet. But the vast majority of what's available on the streets recreationally has been imported primarily from Asia. And I will tell you that from our experience, much of the precursor chemicals in its manufacture and the drug itself was coming in from the People's Republic of China. And there wasn't strong precursor control or regulatory control about that. About 6 weeks ago, the PRC scheduled that, the People's Republic of China scheduled that drug and put very strict limits on its exportation and the precursor chemicals used in its manufacture. This is a huge step forward for the world on this, and we're very appreciative that that has happened. And so I think what you'll see is a better job of supply interdiction. When we talk about opioid addiction, a lot of people look for one simple solution. You'll often hear people talking, for example, about supervised injection sites. And there is a place for those. But I think we need to make sure that we do a better job in supply interdiction, and that's what you've referred to, in making it this less accessible, particularly through illegal distribution. And from a doctor and from a pharmacist, these things actually have a valid therapeutic value in pain control, but they're vastly abused. So you've got to do a better job in supply interdiction. More importantly, I think you've got to do a better job in demand reduction. And part of that is reducing the demand for illegal opioids, but also educating people on safer and more healthful ways of using injectable opioids so that people don't kill themselves. There's also, and I've already alluded to this as well, there's nowhere near enough research, nowhere near enough rehabilitation, treatment, and prevention available. And so one of the challenges we face, I went to see the chief of Vancouver a few weeks ago, and we were talking about fentanyl because in British Columbia, nearly 1,000 people died last year as a fentanyl overdose. And they're seeing nearly 200 people a month dying this year. It is a true crisis. And yet they only had about a dozen rehab beds available to them and almost no detox beds. So you'd get somebody who was clearly in a crisis. They have an antidote that will more or less save the person for about 15 minutes, but you got to be right there when their heart stops in order to administer it. And if there's no detox or rehab services available, you're going to get to do it all again tomorrow. And eventually, we're not going to be successful in saving those individuals. And so there is no one response to this. It's a huge societal challenge, and you've got to do it all. You've got to take the necessary steps to reduce its illegal supply. You've got to reduce the demand for it. And for those who will not be deterred, you got to make sure that there is treatment and rehabilitation services to help them get out of the jeopardy that they're in because of their drug addiction. And so I think that's what is demanded of us as a society. I get a little frustrated when somebody says, well, just lock everybody up, or just save them as they're overdosing. We need a more comprehensive response. It's a more responsible way to deal with it. Yep.
Although there have been many amendments to carding in the past few years, a lot of critics still believe that they have been ineffective, and racial profiling through this still exists. Do you think there are any other means to secure police intelligence without carding by patrol officers?
Yeah. One of the challenges we face in this is there is unfortunately not a very clear understanding in the public's mind about what carding is. And again, if you're referring to racial bias, racially profiling an individual, that's not what carding is. Carding is, and I'll give you just an example of what it actually is. At 2 o'clock in the morning, if you encounter somebody walking through an alleyway in the city of Toronto, most people don't want to be up that alleyway, but as a cop, I spent most of my nights in alleyways like that. And you see somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning, every cop, what they'll do is they'll ask the person, who are you? Where are you going? What are you up to? And if the guy says, I'm so-and-so, I live right there, I'm coming home from work, have a good night. Thanks very much. But if he doesn't have much of an explanation of why he's in the alleyway, and it's an alleyway where there's been a lot of break-and-enters or a lot of robberies or a lot of violence, we need those cops to be asking those people, who are you, what are you doing here? What's going on? And if the guy gives you really bad answers about what he's doing there, then you investigate further. Then that could lead to an arrest, a search, a number of other things. But if it doesn't, you don't have grounds to take any further action, but you know this person, and you know they're in these circumstances that are at least suspicious, but don't get you to reasonable grounds. And so you record that information, and you share that information with other law enforcement people. So somebody's investigating a sexual assault that takes place the next day, or through the night, or a break and enter, or a robbery. You may not have had that information at the time that could have led you to an arrest, but it's shared with somebody who might have other evidence and information that could lead to the solving of that crime. The recording of that information is carding. It is what the police do. And by the way, the police everywhere. I remember when this became an issue when I was still the chief of police, and I'm trying to explain to people, this is what police officers do every day. Quite frankly, most of the other police services in Ontario were hiding under the desk at the time because they didn't want the negative attention that went with that, until somebody said, we're taking that away, and now they've all said, wait a minute, this is how we do police work. So it's important to explain how police work works so that the public can have a good understanding of what doing it right looks like. Now here's what doing it wrong looks like. If you see somebody coming down the street and you decide you should stop and ask them who they are and what they're up to, not because of the suspicious circumstance in which you encounter them, but because of how they look, their race, their ethnicity, their gender. If you're making the decisions based on those grounds, that's based on bias. It can be racism, it can be other forms of bias. And that's wrong. It's also stupid, by the way, because it doesn't lead to making good decisions or gathering good, useful information. The only good information comes from the circumstances, the legitimate observations and circumstances under which you come to believe that it's necessary to ask that all-important question, who are you and where are you going? And so, when we say carding is bad, I would say, are we talking about actually investigating a circumstance, recording the information and sharing it with law enforcement under legitimate areas of inquiry, or are we talking about where bias has influenced the decision that we made? And I will tell you, you're all a well-educated group of people in this room. You all have biases. You're all human beings. Every human being is subject to a bias. Now, there are societies where people own their biases. They're explicit in their racism. This isn't one of those societies. But implicit bias And I've spent a lot of time looking at the science of bias because there's actually some things you can do about it. But implicit bias is a fact of life in our society. We are all impacted by it. When you do a sensitive job like the police have to do, then it's necessary to make sure that the police have the tools, the training, and an understanding of the influence that bias can have on them. And I will tell you, I was a cop for 40 years, and over time you learn to be a little bit more self-aware, and when you start to think about why am I doing this? Why am I stopping and talking to this guy? And you realize the circumstances don't justify it. My biases are what's influencing me. You need to be self-aware, and you need to sort of check that type of thinking, and you need to get better at it. And so we've put all police officers in Toronto through what we call fair and impartial police training, and it's all based on helping them have a better understanding of the science of bias and how it can influence the decisions that they make. I think we need to do a much better job in our society and with the police in making sure that we take the bias out of their decision-making, but we shouldn't take away the legitimate and necessary actions that actually help keep communities safe, help us deal with crime, and help us deal with victimization in our society. And when you take those tools away, you know, it's a choice, a balance, if you would. Thanks.
Bill, I want to thank you on behalf of Ryerson. I think Toronto and Canada are well served with people of your caliber serving in public life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.